4-2 Division 10-4-2. See if we have some Mayday. We have fire into the hallway on the floor above. You need a line upstairs. No water. Mayday. Let it do 7 Mayday. You gotta get a hole in the roof before the steel blows down on everybody. Division 7 to Mayday message. Kid, who's the Mayday? The member from 27 Trunk, he's out of air, so mask has been lowered to him and he's a member with him. But we need to get a hole in the roof. Go up another, we'll come back in half an inch. Destroy it. Hold up on the windows. Hold up on the windows. We got people on the front fire escape. If it's guy wants to do it, all units on the roof. Back out to the stairway. It's out the windows on the top floor. 1-7 inches 4-8. How you making out your line? Cutters on the roof. You're going to need to send the rope over the side. Roof says send the rope over the side to the 4 sides of the building. 1-7 to division. We need the line on the 2.5 smoking and jump water. Okay, 6-7 to division. What, hello? Rescue, who's to rescue? Mayday. Go ahead, Mayday, what's your location? Get the hell out of here, hurry up! We need radio silence. I need water in that 2.5 inch line. 48 inch water in the 2.5 inch line. Mayday, get the rope to the roof, Get it 35 in the rear, 35 in the rear. Rope on the roof, 35 in the rear. The guy wants the division. You get that, we need a rope on the roof. Top floor, we're losing the top floor, Patty. Division 7-10-4. Division 7-2-1, ladder 5-9, finish truck, roof on the rope. We got guys out the rear window, okay? Mayday, 5-6, stand down, fellas. Fireman down in the rear. 2 firemen down in the rear. 2 firemen down in the rear. Let's go. We got 75, put your pump in your Mayday, 2 firemen from the top floor in the rear. We need them. Put my brother in the... Now for, show them the truck. We got a whole company in the rear. They had to... Let us know. We got 6 guys out. If you don't go, you got it. Roof down. Mayday, in the rear. Leave me in there, in the rear. Give your eyes. Go. Let the rope down. Lower the guy in the rope all the way down. Get on that. Yeah, battalion 1-7 division. Go ahead, 1-7. Have you got a good report from the roof? What's going on in the rear, Patty? Having a whole company just goes down the rear, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We'll jump in the rear. We need massive EMS here. Massive injuries.
Okay, what we have there is just actually less than 5 minutes of what happens in the real world. That was known as Black Sunday, January of 2005, New York City Fire Department had an entire company, as I say, bail out of a fire situation. 2 dead, numerous injuries. And in fact, unfortunately, New York City had another fire where they lost another firefighter. So that's why it's known as Black Sunday. We get to a point in the presentation, it's usually near the end, where the presenter is going to ask if you've got any questions. And while it's a little bit different in the virtual format than it is in the real format, usually if you wait to the end, people next to you are going to give you a dirty look if you get ready to ask any questions at all. So let's try to get a couple out of the way up front if we can. First of all, let me also see if I can try to get the presentation in front of some of the other controls that are coming up. And actually, I can't tell whether you in the audience are seeing these other controls that are coming up, such as the window with Justin and Matthew and Maureen in. So if somebody could please send me a message and let me know whether you are seeing that or not. Sometimes Zoom gets to be a little bit interesting.
Barry, your PowerPoint's coming across just fine, and it's a user preference as to what they see. If it's presenter mode, they'll just see you in the PowerPoint, or they can still see everybody else. So
that'll work. Thank you very much. Again, these are all the intricacies of Zoom and the pandemic. And was the audio available on the last clip?
Yep, it sure was.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Again, the questions that I would ask if I were attendee, first of all, is, who's this guy presenting? Again, part of my life spent in Tennessee as the executive director of Knox County Emergency Communications. And I think the things that are kind of germane to this are that I spent time on both sides of the microphone as a director of a 911 center, and also as a fire officer in other states. But I think probably what is important to you is that I started out as a dispatcher. So, and I haven't forgotten how tough the job was back then. And it's a lot tougher now. So, on this last day of the conference, let me thank all of you out there for what you do and what you continue to do. So that's a little bit about me. The other question that I'd probably ask is, what are we going to talk about here today? And although the presentation is entitled Managing Maydays, it's kind of a problem by any other name is still a problem, and a service by any other name still requires our attention. So today we are going to talk about not only fire Maydays, but from the law enforcement side, we'll talk about what commonly is reported to us as officer down, or from the EMS side, perhaps it's medic needs assistance. So we're not going to get too crazy about the terminology or crazy about the service, because we're going to talk about all three, but we are going to split off some of the differences between them so we can take a really closer look at what you're going to be expected to do as part of a Mayday, an officer down, or a medic needs assist process. Now, from a fire standpoint, we can go back to the 1980s. A fire in Hackensack, New Jersey, in Hackensack Ford, killed 5 firefighters when the truss roof collapsed. Now, an important part to note here is that the dispatchers in Hackensack were advised of the firefighter Mayday by somebody from the district attorney's office who was listening to their scanner. They didn't hear it. The incident commander and the fire officers on the scene didn't hear it. So one of the things that we start talking about is when we start talking about Maydays, officers down, etc., is the fact that, hey, you may not even know there's a problem, and why it's important to really pay attention to what's going on around you. There are actually hidden hazards in every community that can be a trap to firefighters. I'm sure most, if not all of us, have watched the fire in Los Angeles that suddenly turned into a fireball and injured 11 firefighters. We've got these same hazards, whether we know it or not, in our local communities. And again, it's not necessarily a Los Angeles or New York that we've talked about. It can be someplace like Dayton. So again, Maydays happen all over. One of the things that I've noticed in my many years of service is that it's really, really a rare bird that becomes the firefighter mortality report that doesn't mention communications, or even any major incident is going to report some sort of problem with communications. If you want to get more information on this, I'd suggest that you Google NIOSH, N-I-O-S-H, firefighter mortality reports, and you'll come across literally dozens of reports, and you'll see that almost all of them will mention a problem with communications as contributing to the fatality. Now, why is this? Well, let's talk about the radio. We certainly use it the most. We probably practiced with it the least. From a field standpoint, I can assure you that firefighters have very few drills involving communications. And from our aspect, from the comm center side, when we get in our classrooms, we don't spend a lot of time on really how to use the radio use. That kind of comes almost from on-the-job training. You sit down and you learn a little bit about it, but how many times do any of our centers, whether it's in our initial training or on our OJT, work in cooperation with the fire department and other services on Mayday drills? The answer is, in many cases, probably we don't. And again, Billy Goldfeder, who runs a website called firefighterclosecalls.com, which I would encourage you to get to know, talks about just exactly this problem. How much time is spent using the radio, but how little time is spent training on it. So let's talk about our radios a little bit, because that's where we're going to hear our Maydays or our officers down, etc. And we can take a look at problems that have been pointed out in some of these NIOSH reports that I was talking about earlier, and how the use or non-use of radios affects this issue. And if you take a look, obviously, for those folks who have got trunk radio systems, especially, units on different frequencies can be a problem. Obviously, information not being shared is a problem. And then if you take a look at the last two on this list, the firefighter in question, who wound up being a Mayday, either didn't have a radio or had a radio that wasn't turned on, or couldn't use their emergency button because their radio wasn't turned on. Now, there's not a lot, in fact, there's nothing we can do about that from the communication side, but I think it's important for us to realize all the complexities that go into managing a Mayday situation. Now, we're going to throw another term at you here. We're not going to go too deep into it, but for those of you who deal a lot with fire departments, you may hear the term LUNAR, which stands for Location, Unit, Name, Assignment, and Resources. And many firefighters are taught to provide this information when declaring a Mayday, and it makes a lot of sense. Okay, who are you and what's going on? Now, we talked a little bit earlier, in fact, just 2 slides ago, about emergency buttons. Okay, Now, emergency buttons and the way they are programmed and the way they are used is not universal. Some agencies say, oh, use them anytime there's a major problem, even to alert other people that there's a problem. Other agencies say use them only if you are in a life-threatening emergency. Past that point, there are different ways of programming emergency buttons. Sometimes an agency may decide to transmit the emergency on the channel on which the firefighter or police officer or medic is operating. Others may have the radios programmed to automatically switch to another channel. It's important before you are sitting in the seat at the console at 3 o'clock in the morning with no one around for guidance to know how these emergency buttons are programmed in your agency. And also, if you are a consolidated center that deals with more than one agency, it's important to know if there are more than one procedure or is there more than one policy. Does each agency have their own policy? Hopefully that is not the case, but I have seen that happen, and like anything else, it makes our life that much more difficult. Now, another thing to think about is that fire departments' ladders don't reach every fire. If you're in a real rural community, perhaps they do, but you know, the most that a typical fire service aerial ladder is going to reach, maybe 8 stories, maybe 9 if the wind is right, but yeah, it's not going to reach every fire. And neither is the radio. And that's an important thing to know about, both from responders' point of view and especially from inside the 911 center. Now, we do a pretty good job in tracking different things in our CAD systems. And I'm going to call it a premise alert file. You may call it something different. The term is not necessarily universal, but you're going to record hazardous materials. Maybe if the building has got previous damage, there may be things like, you know, where the gas and electric shutoffs or anything else that may be helpful to the responding firefighters. But what about radio dead spots? They are probably as detrimental to firefighters' health as are hazardous materials or any of the other things that you may track. So one of the things that I have always tried to suggest is that fire departments and the 911 center get together and use the premise history file as a way of tracking radio dead spots that firefighters immediately will know if they are dispatched to a particular facility. Hey, your radio may not work at all, or there may be areas of this building, especially if it's a hospital or university or a large factory or even a school, where there's below grade or very heavy construction where your radio is not going to get in or out. And don't forget that radio is the lifeline for firefighters responding to calls. Now, let's take a look at managing the Maydays, because that's kind of why we're here. And let's take a look at 10 deadly assumptions that are made before the Mayday call occurs. Now again, I am not going to read each and every one of these. Hopefully you can see it on the screen. But let's talk about these. And these 5 that you see here are assumptions that people make ahead of time. And, you know, I think the biggest one, and we'll put these all together, is to assume, number one, that you've even got a Mayday plan. I've talked to a lot of folks out there who found out they did not have a Mayday plan as soon as somebody declared a Mayday. The second takeaway from all this is that if you've got a Mayday plan, make sure that everybody in your organization knows what it is. okay? Because this is not the time to pull out the SOP manual. If you have somebody in trouble on the other end of the radio, you don't want to be dusting the dust off of the binder and saying, okay, gee, what do I do now? You've got to know it. And also, again, like we talked about the emergency buttons, a deadly assumption is that all Mayday plans are the same. Now, hopefully, again, if you are a consolidated center and you are dispatching for 10 different fire departments, hopefully there are not 10 different Mayday plans. And this is something for all the directors that may be out there on the call today. I would just urge you to work with your user agencies because the telecommunicator response to this has to be automatic. You can't be thinking, what side of the street is this fire on? What am I supposed to do now? Now, the other 5 points here kind of deal with what happens when the Mayday has happened. And I want to refer back to the New York City Black Sunday audio because there was a lot going on there in 5 minutes. Now, you know, were all the resources accounted for at all times? Did everybody or anyone hear the Mayday? Do you assume that the emergency is over? I mean, do you assume that there's just one Mayday? If you go back to that tape, you'll recall that the first Mayday was solved pretty quickly. Hey, it was somebody from 27 truck. There's somebody with them now. They brought them some more air. Everything is fine. And then bingo, probably not a minute later, you had additional Maydays. So after the first one was over, the emergency was not over. It obviously just kept on going. Now, assuming that when the Mayday is over, that everything returns to normal, probably the furthest thing from the truth. Having been through these situations, I can tell you that there are a lot of moving pieces going on at once. You are juggling a lot of balls in the air. And so when the Mayday is over, you are far from normal. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth about how far from normal you are in just a minute or two. So bear with me. And I think the final one to discuss from our standpoint is assuming that communications personnel are not affected by Mayday situations. We most certainly are. Even when they work out right, it is a very stressful, upsetting situation. We certainly have an affinity with those folks that we dispatch. In fact, sometimes it's even been called a mother hen type of mentality. And boy, we are protective. We can be PO'd at them many times when things are just not going our way. But boy, let somebody try to mess with my unit or our unit and, you know, all hell breaks loose. So yeah, assuming the communications personnel are not affected by Mayday situations is probably the worst assumption that can be made. Now, before things start to go bad, there are often warning signs. You know, they can be subtle, they can be understated, but they're always there. You know, just like this loose sign that says, hey, loose gravel, that's a little bit of an understatement to take a look at what's happened to the road ahead. So we have to be very careful in the 911 center to try to get a jump on what comes ahead. Now, there are clues that can be heard on the fire radio, and these come from an article in Firehouse magazine, not one of mine, but from folks who really studied hundreds of Mayday situations. And these are the types of communications that you will hear on the Fireground channel immediately prior to a Mayday being declared. And again, I'm not going to read all of them, but you can see it talks about fire conditions that are deteriorating, that there are some problems, such as, hey, we haven't found the fire, or we're getting low on air, or that it is a hoarder structure. And I've included the term Collier's Mansion there because if you have not heard that term before from a fire service standpoint, it means a situation where you have entered normally a private residence where there is almost floor to ceiling accumulation of, you name it, trash, debris, old boxes, etc. So that's a term where if you hear it, hey, this is one of those subtle warning signs that trouble may be coming. And obviously, there are more signs. Some of them, again, have to do with worsening fire conditions. Others have to do with the ability to either move in towards the fire or getting out from the fire. Or again, the command has lost communications with multiple crews. And probably the most telling one of that came from the World Trade Center. Again, there are obviously exterior physical signs that there was a problem, but command has lost communications with multiple crews, obviously popped up on 9/11. Now, I mentioned the monitoring of radio channels, and I don't know how you handle it in your agency, but National Fire Protection Standard 1221 says that when an incident commander asks for it to happen, a telecommunicator is supposed to be assigned to monitor the fireground and to be relieved of all their other duties. Now, again, don't know how you do it in your agency. I know that most of us are staffed at best to handle a normal day, whatever that is. And we're pretty hard pressed to spare somebody to monitor a fire, or God forbid, there should be multiple major fires where we just don't have the people to do it. On the other hand, here's a national standard that says we should be doing it. How do we deal with it? It's a tough nut to crack. It really and truly is. And unfortunately, you're not going to get any answers here today, but you just know that it's important for you to know what's going on there. Now, what happens when it occurs? Well, we're going to use the term validate here to deal with the steps involved in how to manage a Mayday. First of all, you need to validate or confirm that a Mayday actually exists. I can't tell you how many telecommunicators I've talked about who have said to me, you know, I had to ask my partner, or I had to double check again, not that I actually heard a Mayday. Part of it is that they really weren't sure, but another part of it is they didn't want to hear it. They're like, oh my God, no, I'm not really hearing that. So first of all, you know, find out that you've actually got one. Second of all, confirm it and make sure that everybody who needs to know has that information as well. Listen, it's really important once a Mayday is transmitted to listen for additional calls for help and even check back if you have to periodically if you cannot get contact again initially on your attempt with whoever's called the Mayday. Okay. You've got to inform everybody who is supposed to respond to the Mayday, and whether that's units on the scene, the incident commander, whether you are supposed to dispatch additional alarms or additional services, make sure that you do that. And make sure you know ahead of time what your policy requires. Again, Maydays are many times a life-threatening situation, and it's not time to try to find where you put the SOP manual and what you're supposed to do. Okay. Divert all non-essential radio traffic to other channels. Sometimes this is tough, but if you've got 3 or 4 other fires using the same fire ground frequency as a fire on which a Mayday has been transmitted, you really need to do your best to get everything extraneous off of the channel. Now, the incident commander should be taking the same steps at the scene, so the basic purpose is to really ensure that the unit or units calling a Mayday and the resources that are going to help that Mayday are the only people using that channel. Now, you've got to account for your resources, okay? Who's involved? It's really, really imperative that you keep track of everybody that you're supposed to be keeping track of, okay? Now, you've got some assignments out there that are going to change because of a Mayday. You may have companies moving. You may have companies moving on their own. And that's something that you really have to stay abreast of. We're going to talk about that a little bit later on, but keeping track or keeping account of your resources is critical. And this is one of these things that I talked about. Hey, is everything back to normal? No, because there may be periods of time where you don't know where all your resources are. Not necessarily your fault, because a lot of people are moving in a lot of different situations and directions when they hear that Mayday. Terminate. You've got to know who's responsible for terminating the Mayday, and you need to do it and cancel it when you are authorized to do so. And again, have to make sure for a couple of reasons. Number one, you have to make sure that, yes, it is supposed to be terminated, because again, we saw the situation in that earlier New York tape. You went from one Mayday to another. Things can change quickly. And secondary, you're going to need to get the message out, because you may have dozens of units coming, lights and sirens from a lot of different locations, that once everything is safe, those people need to slow down, or you're going to have another problem. Okay. When it's all over, you need to evaluate, okay, what worked, what didn't work, what should you do differently next time? But I would encourage you to write notes as soon as possible, right after this happens, so you don't forget, because you're going to be on to something else. So think about what worked, what didn't, what to do next time. And I cannot encourage too much to get your folks involved in after action, post-mortem, whatever you want to call it, discussions of major incidents, especially Maydays or officers down, etc. I mentioned that the person in the red shirt in the center is one of my supervisors when I was at Raleigh Wake. He was and he is talking here to a group of personnel who are Raleigh firefighters, and he is talking to them basically because he was working the primary fire channel when an entire block of downtown Raleigh was under construction and was lost. So it's really important to have this exchange with your user agencies on any of these types of situations in order to better your process going forward. Now, just a little bit of statistics again from the New York City Fire Department for those people who are inclined to kind of want to know these things. Basically, typically takes about 5 minutes to locate someone who's declared a Mayday, another 7 minutes to get them out of the fire building. Most of the people who called Maydays were located by the first alarm units, or the people who went with them, rather than any specialized rescue team like a RIT or FAST team. And unfortunately, more than 3/4 of the people who declared Mayday had no air left when they were found. So these are just some things to think about, especially the last, which really lends to show you how critical these situations can be.
Here's 12, 120, 21, 28, call Furey, 1035 West Lexus at Home Depot.
118 something is my family, I love them.
I can't copy.
118 tell my family, I love them. Oh, yeah.
We got crews coming. I'm getting medical.
Okay, tell my family I love them. Kind of difficult to listen to sometimes. As it turns out, that officer actually did not make it. And so as a telecommunicator, you may actually hear the last words of a public safety officer. Pretty sobering. Another sobering fact is that 55% of officer fatalities occur in the South. Don't have any particular reason for that, but that is a current statistic that more than half occur in the South. So how do we deal with an officer down? When we're talking about a fatality here, there's a difference between a Mayday, officer down, and a line of duty death. And a line of duty death is what we'll talk about in the second hour. And there are some similarities in the way we handle it, and there are some significant differences. And at the end of the day, hopefully you'll know both and be better prepared to understand it. But again, there's a lot of things that are very similar. What's going on? Where is it? Who's involved? What's the reason? And again, one thing that becomes maybe a little different from the fire, although with attacks on public safety personnel, perhaps not, is a confirmation of scene safety. Hey, is the actor still there? And if you've got a description of whoever caused the problem, their description of that person, any weapons, and a direction of travel. Again, clear the air, dispatch assistance, and be sure to pass on intelligence to other agencies. I cannot stress this enough. There are numerous situations where the very basic information was not passed on to neighboring agencies, and difficulties ensued. Again, if you've got to send EMS, stage them if necessary. And the one thing that I would say is that when you stop dealing with the immediacy of what that officer was doing and make sure that that gets taken care of, a lot of what we're talking about here is asking questions and following procedures that we would in any situation that did not involve a public safety officer. In other words, if you've got an officer who's shot, the same questions apply, the same response applies to that call, regardless of who's involved. You're going to have to notify command staff that there's an officer down. You may have to get special teams like SWAT, special vehicles, again, depending upon the situation. You've got to make your notifications. Probably somebody in the mayor's office or city manager's office is supposed to be told about these things. Secure a PIO, we'll talk about that later, but any one of these situations is going to overwhelm you, not only with calls directly affecting the incident, but with people wanting to know information about the incident. So it really becomes a crazy, crazy situation with the phone ringing. Again, you've got an officer down, repeated and rebroadcasted as necessary. We often don't apply incident command tactics to the 911 center. I suspect that we should more often than we do, but designate a primary dispatcher to handle all this. Hey, a single point of contact to the outside. Give somebody that responsibility. You've got to coordinate your channel assignments, who is where. You may have to set up patches if you're dealing with other agencies, for example. Keep track of your resources. Mentioned this again under fire. I will say it here. One of the biggest problems you'll get, loss of knowledge about where everybody is, because people self-dispatch, or as we call it down south, one of those y'all come calls, and everybody just ups and goes. Now, obviously, you need to get assistance to the injured officer, and that's, you know, high on the list. There's just so many things going on here. You know, I'm not saying wait till the end. High on the list, obviously get assistance to the injured officers. You know, got to try to protect other people from injury. And again, you do that by sharing information and by getting the right information. Then, depending upon what was going on, that initial call has to be completed. If you've got an officer and officers who are ambushed on the way to a call, hey, is that initial call a real situation? And if so, it needs to be responded to by somebody else. And then life goes on. You've got to maintain response to everything else that's going on in the community. You've got to find the resources. You've still got to answer 911 because it doesn't stop ringing for other calls in the community. So it, again, very stressful, very busy situation, but plan ahead, think about it, and you can make it through. Now, let's take a quick look at our folks on the EMS side, okay? And every year, you know, at least one EMS professional is killed on duty. And they have a pretty significant rate of assault while being on duty. And again, you can Google this and you can find different cases. We're not going to talk about them all today, but those are things that subject any public safety personnel today to issues or interaction with the public. Every year, there's about 29 fatal ambulance crashes with 33 fatalities. Now, it doesn't mean that they are all medical personnel. A lot of the people killed in those crashes are unfortunately patients. Yeah. If you want to talk about having a bad day, imagine that you are injured somehow, picked up with an ambulance, and then you're killed in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. So that's somebody who's not having a really good day. And don't forget, you know, a lot of EMS injuries do involve transportation. And don't forget the dangers that are faced by airborne medics. Every year, you're going to see multiple fatalities that come from helicopter crashes as well. It's an unfortunate part of the job. And again, something that we can't do too much about from the 911 side. Now, how can you help? Well, obviously, number one, when somebody from EMS is responding to a scene, you need to validate scene security before they go. You need to share any premise history that you've got because people at a residence who are not friends of the cops are not friends of EMTs either. Periodic status checks, and also alert to travel issues. If there are people coming from responding from other directions, roads closed, detours, et cetera, if you can keep the crews updated, that takes a little bit of a load off of them. Another thing is, from any situation, whether it's fire, EMS, what have you, part of what you need to do is when somebody asks for assistance is to determine the nature of the assistance needed. And again, some of the worst, it seems some of the worst offenders to telling people at dispatch what the problem is are the first responders. Now, when you answer a 911 call, you're expected to say, hey, find out just exactly what the problem is. But how many times have you gotten a request from a first responder, oh, just send the cops down here, or I need a fire truck, or I need an ambulance, and that's all they tell you. So again, try your best to pry the nature of assistance out of them. Now, again, we talked about how COVID and this crazy summer has changed things. Well, according to the International Association of Firefighters, Mayday events have increased 35% during the COVID and civil unrest, and that 81% of Maydays occur between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. So for you night shifters out here on the call, this is for you. You're going to get the vast majority of Maydays. We mentioned NFPA standards. I would encourage you all to check with nfpa.org. You can actually read standards for free there. One of them that I would point you to, and we're not going to talk about today, is Standard 3000 regarding active shooters. One of the points of distress is communications between all active stakeholders. No matter what type of problem you are facing, you need to share that data between all local law enforcement and any fire and EMS agencies involved. What other things are we dealing with? Well, yeah, we talk about defunding the police. As we go forward, will cutbacks in law enforcement put other services at risk? We don't know, because I think a lot of people that talk about defunding the police don't really have a plan. But it's something that we have to look at going forward in terms of safety of all agencies. Now, as a final word, I would ask that as we talk about protecting our uniform services, I would ask you all to protect yourselves. There have been a number of agencies who have seen direct threats made against telecommunications personnel. Here's one out of Wycliffe, Ohio. I know Aurora, Colorado had some significant issues. The list goes on and on. As they say in the trade, watch your sixes, please, during this. Because what we've seen is that attacks, our public safety officers are no longer limited to the police, okay? And the bottom line is, if you wear clothing that's similar looking to law enforcement, you may actually put yourself in the same category for risk. Now, for all you super dispatchers out there, and you know who you are, you know you dress more like a cop than the cop, this may not be the time to do it. So, in fact, there are some agencies who have advised dispatchers to scrape all the 911 or law enforcement decals off their car. Use your own judgment, follow whatever rules your administration puts forward, but just be very, very careful, because the threat is, in fact, very real.
Days after a man is shot on a rural Saline County road. Good evening, I'm Josh Berry. Donna and Kevin are off. We're learning the shooting victim is a 911 dispatcher and was wearing a Little Rock police polo when this all happened. The Saline County Sheriff's Office was called out to that shooting Wednesday evening on Detani Road in Bauxite. Fox 16's Mitch McCoy joins us now looking into this further. And Mitch, you talked with the shooting victim's family today. How's he doing?
Well, Josh, he's already out of the hospital and expected to make a full recovery. I spoke to his mother-in-law just hours ago, and she says that this seems like a case of him being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
You know, they just got him down, I guess, and left him for dead.
There's nothing but the sound of nature on this rural Saline County road in Bauxite Friday. But terrible memories run through Tanya Shellnut's head.
He was just trying to do a good thing.
She says her daughter and son-in-law, Devin Hunt, were victims of a random crime 2 days before. The couple was driving down Detonte Road, pulled over, put their car in parked, put their emergency flashers on, and then seconds later, the shooting.
The man said, you know, we could use some jumper cables. So he said, I have some jumper cables. And so he was going to go get the jumper cables. And as he turned around to go to his vehicle to get them, the man shot him.
Sources say Devin was in his dispatcher's uniform at the time of the shooting, including a dark blue polo that says Little Rock Police.
They come across here and they were doing something obviously that they were guilty of. And that alarmed them, I'm sure.
The Saline County Sheriff's Office saying Friday they're investigating every angle right now and not ruling anything out. While bad memories may exist on this road surrounded by woods, Tanya says she'll continue to keep an extra eye out for the alleged shooter.
I want them found. I want them found. I want them off the street.
A couple of notes here. The suspect's vehicle is described as a dark-colored mid-size SUV. The passenger who allegedly shot that 911 dispatcher is a white man in his late 30s to early 40s, medium build and average height. And Josh, he was last seen wearing tan cargo-colored pants. And of course, if anyone knows anything about this incident, they're asked to call the Saline County Sheriff's Office. Back to you.
All right. Folks, I am back. Again, while that was an isolated incident, unfortunately, the threat is becoming more and more real. So I would ask you all to please take care of yourself as well as those whom you dispatch. That concludes this morning, or excuse me, the first part of this session. And again, even though you are at your homes, what I would like to do is I'd like to put about a 5-minute break between this section and the next session. I know that some of you may have some childcare issues. You may have to go out and have a smoke or do whatever you need to do. So what I would like to do is just put a 5-minute break between this and the second portion of the session, which is LODD is a 4-letter word. So I'm showing it to be 10:54 now, your time. So let's come back in 5 minutes if we can and start the next session. Thank you.